Okay, this lecture is on geographic characteristics of states. So we're going to start to look at some of the things about how states are represented in space. So first topic, or first idea is territory size, micro versus macro. Does size equal power? No. There are a lot of microstates, as we looked at with Sealand, but also the Vatican. And there are a lot of macro states, large states like Russia and the United States. And the size of it doesn't necessarily equal power. The Vatican City is a very small state, but it has a significant amount of political power around the world. However, greater land area could equal greater resources. However, it also could lead to problems with regulating that area, such as communication and transportation. And this is something historically Russia has dealt with, is their communication, transportation, and access to resources. So size is not necessarily an indicator for success. We look at Russia and their purchasing power parity per person as of 2015 is half that of the United States, but their land area is double the size. So just because it's a large state doesn't necessarily mean it's powerful, although Russia still is one of the more powerful states in the world. So we're going to talk a lot about territory shape in this lecture. There are 5 different types of shapes of territories: elongated, compact, prorupt, fragmented, and perforated. And each of these shapes of states leads to some different advantages and disadvantages with the way that people within the state relate to each other, either culturally or politically. The shape of the state can affect communication, transportation, and it could also lead to almost separatist movements within it, based on the shape as well. So let's start taking a look at some of these and then some of the problems and advantages, disadvantages. So first, we have a compact state. These states typically resemble a circle-like shape. Here's an example of one in Zimbabwe. Many of these states have capitals that are near the center, and so they are pretty easy to govern for the most part. They're geographically stable, meaning that there's no like sort of weird borders or things that jut out, or they're not perforated in any way. And they typically, make it easy to communicate and transportate within. So some good examples of them are Poland, Iceland, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe. Of course, the size of it plays a role, but generally these states are pretty stable. But sometimes they do have issues related to access to resources or access to ocean borders and things like that, depending on their location. A lot of times we see compact states landlocked. Fragmented states consist of 2 or more pieces. So we have the Philippines as an example here. They have the islands in the north, islands in the south, and a whole bunch in between. This can make interactions very difficult within the country because of transportation. How do you get from one island to another? How do you get people from the south together with the north? And sometimes you can develop different cultures. There could be individual island cultures here. And the extreme of this leads to separatist movements. We saw this with Indonesia, where East Timor had an independence movement and they won and they separated. And so fragmented states can sometimes be very disjointed. Sometimes they can be very united, but it all depends on the specific culture. Elongated states, like we have here in Norway, can create big distances between the sides, or the north and the south there. And sometimes what we see is a division between the northern and southern, or eastern and western parts of the states. And this can create sort of separatist areas that are separate from the core. For example, in Norway, here's the core at the bottom with the capital Oslo and the economic power of Norway in the south, and then you have the people up here in the north, and people in the south kind of think of northerners as sort of strange mountain people, and northerners can be jealous of people in the south because they're the ones that hold the more political and social power. So sometimes the extreme of that could be the division, like we had in Vietnam. Vietnam divided into north and south. Chile is another example. Argentina is an elongated state, and so sometimes we get these different cultures in north and south. Italy, great example of that. The industrial north, the agricultural rural south, creates very different cultures within one place. Prorupt states have an area that extend kind of far away from the core, and these again are places that are can create a geographic faction. Southern Thailand considers themselves a bit different than northern Thailand, and a little bit more Malaysian here in the south, a bit more Chinese, Burmese in the north, and it can create problems with transportation, problems with communication, and again, different cultures. A perforated state is a country broken by another country, meaning that there's a country inside that other country. So you can have an enclave or you can have an exclave, and that's all kind of depends on how they're located. Okay, so we look at South America is a perforated state, so it's got a hole poked in it by Lesotho. Okay, and that would be an enclave. It's kind of within it. Okay, so Lesotho and South Africa. An exclave would be the piece that lays outside of it. So if we look at Armenia here, so Armenia is a perforated state with an exclave, right? It's inside Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a perforated state with an enclave in it. Okay? Azerbaijan is also a perforated state with an exclave. Holy cow. So we can understand why this place of the world is so complicated, because there's perforated states with enclaves and exclaves, and this particular situation here with Azerbaijan and Armenia is very, very complicated, because you have to go across country borders to communicate with each other, and it can make governing very, very difficult. This little enclave here, that's potentially a place that could be taken over. Could be claimed by another state. So this creates all kinds of problems, and these types of situations often lead to conflict, especially when there's a claim that one country should be, or one part of the country should be part of another. So thinking about this, a little bit of analysis shape, what U.S. state is an exclave? The same state is also prorupt. And what state shape best describes California? So think about those for a second before we move on to the next slide. And we've got Alaska, right? There's prorupt. It's also an exclave. And what shape best describes California? Elongated, right? California is an elongated state, and you have a Northern California culture and a Southern California culture. And sometimes Northern California wants to separate and form their own state. Boom. There it is. Okay. So territory and size can shape and influence political stability, but does not determine social, political, or economic well-being. So it can have an influence, but it's not necessarily determinable. So just because a state is elongated doesn't mean it's going to have problems north and south. Or just because a state is compact does not mean it's going to have economic well-being or political or social stability. These are just, based on history and based on some examples, those things could happen. All right, so now one of our favorite topics, very current, very relevant, boundaries, building walls. Look at that. Interesting how history repeats itself. But anyway, what is a boundary? Boundary is a vertical plane that cuts through airspace and ground to determine ownership, right? So here's country A, country B, and there's this vertical plane in between. Right. So problems with boundaries is that sometimes states draw boundaries without the knowledge of underground resources, and this can lead to conflict. Great example of that, oil fields in Kuwait and Iraq. Wow, Iraq didn't realize that there were all these oil fields in Kuwait, and this one here goes across boundaries. And so this can cause problems, in this case create an international conflict between Iraq and Kuwait when Iraq invaded to take over the oil fields of Kuwait. Question about boundaries, though, that's coming up now with satellites and air travel and things along those lines about who manages boundaries in space and air. Are these boundaries, international and extraterrestrial, right? Airline traffic, satellite space. So there are lots of current issues regarding boundaries that we really don't have answers to yet that are coming up as we evolve with our technology. So how are boundaries created? Well, they are defined usually written down. Someone has to define them. They have to be delimited, they have to be mapped, and sometimes there are actual physical demarcations, marked post-fence walls. And you will typically see all three of these in an internationally accepted boundary. It's defined, it's legally written down, it's mapped, and then there is some sort of sign or demarcation. So if you think about our own states, when you go from Pennsylvania to Maryland, it's legally agreed to where that boundary is. It's on a map, and there's a sign, "Welcome to Maryland," or "Thank you for leaving, thank you for visiting Pennsylvania," so that you know you went from one to the other. Okay, so there are lots of different types of boundaries. There are geometric boundaries, which are typically straight line boundaries. You see a lot of those in the western part of the United States, with Canada. And then there are also physical boundaries, which typically are related on physical features. So you have like straight line boundaries, which are like geometric, and then you have a lot of these physical boundaries. Ooh, look at that, right? So if you take a look at the patterns of the United States, the United States has both of those, right? And if you look at the eastern United States, a lot of physical boundaries because that's how the original colonies were established. And if you look at the western United States, there's a lot of geographic boundaries. Why? Because we started to apply the Northwest Territory Land Ordinance of 1787 all over the United States that creates grids. And plus, there's a lot of open space here with no people, and it was just easier to draw lines. Interesting. Okay, real cool video on the U.S.-Canada border. If you just Google U.S.-Canada border, no touching, you'll get a pretty cool video on that. And I don't know, yeah, no touching zone. You'll get a pretty cool video on that about the U.S.-Canada border and some strange little enclaves and exclaves on both sides. So types of boundaries, there are physical, political, or natural political boundaries. We have a lot of those in the United States. For example, with the United States and Mexico, we have a natural boundary, the Rio Grande River, and we are soon to also have a physical political boundary. There's going to be a wall there. Well, we don't know for sure, but it's proposed. Other types of boundaries, you have these genetic boundaries. Sometimes boundaries are established by ethnicity, right? So, like for example, in Malaysia and Indonesia, there's ethnic Indonesians, ethnic Malaysians, ethnic Bruneians, and sometimes those are defined, before humans settled, and they're cultural ethnic. We can have superimposed boundaries, ones that are forcibly drawn by someone else. And we can have relic boundaries, borders that have existed, but we really don't need them to exist anymore, like North and South Vietnam. They're one Vietnam, no more border. Boundary disputes are very, 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 very common. When we talk about the conflict of states, a lot of it has to do with boundaries. And they could be territorial, definitional, or they could be positional, locational. So if we talk about Yemen, there is a serious border boundary here between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Why? Well, because there is resources there. Oh, surprise. Oil. So, there's a strange sort of boundary here, and Yemen claims their boundary should go here. Saudi Arabia claims should go in there. And the oil-rich border, it hasn't been determined yet. So, territorial, definitional. Functional, operational, this is the United States and Mexico, right? Border dispute. How do we handle immigration from each side to another? Our solution is build a wall. Mexico wants something else. And sometimes we also have resource allocational issues, allocational borders. The Colorado River provides water to basically a third of the Midwest. And there are some issues with people upstream, damming it off and using it. And what happens to people downstream? So it supplies water, and we get this disputes between Colorado and like New Mexico, Arizona, California, and downriver. They have these arguments about, who can use the water supply and how do they treat it and deal with it. So this is some examples of boundaries and disputes. We're going to fast forward through that because I want to get to the law of the sea. The law of the sea is a big deal. The UN Convention in 1954, agreed to by 152 countries, expanded the boundaries of the above the sea. So initially, it was just this sort of 3-mile radius that belonged to countries. Now, every country has an exclusive 200-mile economic zone. Why is that important? Because there's stuff down here that we can drill and we can get, and countries want to own it. So thinking about why are owning islands and stuff important? Wow, look at how your boundaries change if you own islands. That's why many colonial holdings right now are islands, because these islands make the borders of countries a lot bigger. Wow, look at Hawaii, for example. That gives the United States exclusive access to thousands of miles of stuff to drill for and look for in the ocean and possibly resources. So the Law of the Sea, 1954, huge deal when it comes to the boundaries